Imagine a woman in dark sunglasses sitting before a judge. She doesn't speak. The courtroom waits, breath held, restless, watching for the moment she'll take them off. She doesn't, even after being asked 3 times. And everyone senses it. This isn't defiance. It's something else. The courtroom in Providence feels smaller than usual. The hum of the heating vent, the creak of the benches, the quiet rustle of a folded newspaper. Every sound seems magnified. When Judge Caprio enters, the air shifts. He greets the room with his usual warmth, but the woman at the defendant's table doesn't respond. She sits straight, clutching her purse like a shield. Her posture says confidence. Her silence betrays fear. The charge is simple: repeated speeding violations and failure to appear in court. Yet somehow, this feels heavier. Caprio glances at her, then at the papers. "Ma'am," he says lightly, "you do know this isn't Hollywood, right?" A ripple of laughter runs through the room, gentle, cautious. She answers flatly, still behind her glasses. "I just don't like people looking at me." The laughter dies. Caprio studies her, the way he often studies people who say too little. "That's fair," he replies softly. "But when you're in court, people tend to look at you, especially when they're waiting for the truth." She shifts, uncomfortable, pressing her hands tighter against the purse. "Your name?" he asks. "Rachel." "Rachel," he repeats. "You've been cited 3 times for speeding, and you've ignored all 3 summonses. That's unusual." She exhales sharply, a small, controlled sound. "I was busy." "Busy?" he says, eyebrows lifting. "Too busy for the law?" She hesitates. "Too busy surviving." That line lands somewhere deep in the room. Caprio leans forward slightly, but doesn't press. "The car you were driving, registered to someone else." "Who?" "Does it matter?" she replies. "It does to me," he says quietly. She hesitates. Then, almost inaudibly, "My ex-husband." The gallery stirs, a faint buzz of surprise, a cough, a chair squeak. Caprio raises his hand for silence. "All right," he says. "Let's stay with the facts." He reads from the file. "Unpaid fines, missed appearances, escalating penalties. You've been given multiple chances, Ms. Rachel. Why ignore them all?" Her voice hardens, a brittle kind of defense. "Because I didn't think anyone here would care." A pause. The judge sets his papers down. "You might be surprised," he says gently. She gives a small, humorless laugh. "Doubt it." The air grows heavier. Caprio doesn't fill the silence. He lets it grow until her words echo back at her. When he finally speaks, his tone changes, lower, measured. "Ignoring the court isn't just about law, Ms. Rachel. It's about hope. When people stop showing up, it's usually because they've stopped believing it matters." Her lips tighten. "Believing doesn't pay bills." "No," he says, "but it keeps you human." She shifts again. The glasses hide her eyes, but her voice softens just slightly. "I'm not a criminal, Judge. I just ran out of ways to keep up." For the first time, Caprio's expression flickers, sympathy behind discipline. "That's what we're here to find out," he says. He leans back, his hand resting on the gavel. "We'll start simple. You'll tell me the story behind these tickets. Not the one written on paper, the real one." The woman doesn't answer. But something in her posture loosens, a breath breaking through the wall she built. And for the first time, the silence in the courtroom feels less like resistance, and more like confession waiting for courage. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. "Let's start simple," Judge Caprio said, his tone gentle but unyielding. "Tell me who you are, not who you were supposed to be, just who you are." The woman hesitated, fingers tightening on her purse strap. "My name's Rachel," she said finally. "I used to be a stylist." A pause. "In another life." The room stayed silent. Caprio tilted his head. "What happened to that life?" She gave a small, dry laugh. "Divorce happened. That happened. Everything that doesn't fit into a nice report happened." Her voice was calm, but the edges trembled. Through the dark lenses, her expression remained unreadable. Caprio flipped through the papers. "You owned a salon, yes?" "I did," she answered quietly. "A good one. We had regulars, steady work. I knew every client's name." She smiled faintly, almost involuntarily. "I even did the mayor's wife's hair once." "Sounds like success," the judge said. "It was," Rachel replied. "Until it wasn't." The words hung between them, sharp and small. Bit by bit, her story began to emerge. not through confession, but exhaustion. After her divorce, she lost the shop, the apartment, the savings. The car stayed registered under her ex-husband's name because she couldn't afford the paperwork to change it. One more thing he kept, she murmured. Her daughter lived with her in a roadside motel now. The word motel came out almost as an apology. Caprio didn't interrupt. He'd heard hundreds of excuses in his years on the bench. This didn't sound like one. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "And these tickets, you ignored them because you couldn't pay?" She exhaled, shaky but controlled. "Because when you're trying to find food for a 10-year-old, a court date feels like another luxury you can't afford." The courtroom stilled. Even the creak of the benches quieted. Caprio nodded slowly. "I understand, Ms. Rachel, but the law doesn't stop for anyone's pain. That's the trouble with it. It expects us to keep up, even when we're crawling." Her chin lifted slightly, defensive again. "I wasn't crawling. I was surviving." For the first time, her sunglasses slipped as she shifted. The judge caught a glimpse beneath, the faint shadows of sleeplessness, a bruise just beginning to yellow at the edge of her cheek. He didn't mention it. Instead, he asked, softly, "And your daughter? How is she handling all this?" Rachel swallowed hard. She's fine. She thinks it's a game, moving from place to place. She says the motel room feels like an adventure." Her voice cracked. "But she shouldn't have to be that brave." Caprio leaned forward, elbows on the bench. "And yet she is. Maybe because she has you." Rachel looked down. For the first time, her sunglasses came off completely. The reaction was immediate, an audible silence. Her eyes were red, tired, but fierce. Caprio spoke with deliberate calm. "I'll tell you what I see. Not a criminal. Not a liar. Just someone who stopped believing she deserved better." Her throat worked, but no words came. He continued, softly. "You can't hide forever, Ms. Rachel. Not from the law, and not from yourself. I can help with the first. The second, that's up to you." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The judge picked up his pen and set it down again. "We'll continue," he said. "But now that the glasses are off, let's keep the truth that way too." In the back row, someone murmured, "Poor woman." Another whispered, "She's stronger than she looks." And as the session adjourned for a short recess, Rachel stayed seated, eyes fixed on the table, like someone who hadn't expected to be seen and suddenly didn't know what to do with it. Judge Caprio reopened the file, the rustle of paper cutting through the still air. "Ms. Rachel," he began, "I've reviewed your record, and something doesn't quite line up." His tone wasn't harsh, just precise, the kind that left no room to hide. He adjusted his glasses, eyes skimming the page. "Your vehicle is registered under your ex-husband's name, correct?" "Yes," she said quietly. "And yet," Caprio continued, tapping a line with his pen, "the violations occurred after the divorce. Same car, same license plate, but according to the report, you weren't even living at that address anymore." Rachel said nothing. The judge leaned back slightly. "So, who was behind the wheel?" The silence stretched. Every sound in the room, every breath, every shift of fabric, felt amplified. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "He was her ex-husband." Caprio's pen paused midair. "You're saying your ex committed these violations with the car still in your name?" She nodded once. "He knew it was still registered to me. He said he'd take care of it. He took care of it all right." The audience stirred, a quiet buzz of disapproval rippling across the benches. Caprio's tone hardened slightly. "And you let him?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "I didn't let him. I didn't have a choice. He knew I couldn't afford another car. I thought if I kept my head down, he'd eventually stop." He studied her for a long moment. "You thought silence would buy peace." She didn't respond, but the flicker in her expression answered for her. Caprio closed the file gently. "Ms. Rachel, I've sat on this bench long enough to know when someone's hiding more than a traffic story." His voice softened, but the edge of authority remained. "What aren't you telling me?" Her eyes dropped to her hands. The knuckles were white from the pressure of holding her purse. "You wouldn't believe me." "I've heard everything," Caprio said quietly. "Try me." Her shoulders lifted with a shaky breath. "He used the tickets to find me," she whispered. "Every time I got another notice, it meant he still knew where I was." The room went utterly still. Caprio didn't speak right away. The gravity of her words settled like dust over every seat. Rachel continued, her voice trembling. "He told me once that I'd never get away from his name. That no one, no police, no judge, would take my side. That people like me don't win. Her last words barely carried. He said I was nothing without him. A low gasp rippled through the gallery. Someone muttered, Jesus. Another, that's not justice. Caprio's eyes softened. He set the papers aside and folded his hands. Ms. Rachel, he said, you're wrong about one thing. She looked up, startled by the firmness in his tone. People like you do win, Caprio said. Because you're still standing here. You showed up. That's how it starts. She blinked quickly, but no tears fell. Showing up doesn't change what he did. No, the judge replied. But it changes what comes next. The quiet in the courtroom wasn't pity anymore. It was respect. A collective recognition that something larger than a traffic violation had just unfolded. Caprio leaned forward again, his voice barely above a murmur. I want you to listen carefully, Ms. Rachel. The law can hold people accountable, but only if the truth stands tall enough to be seen. Right now, you have that chance. I won't ask for every detail, not unless you're ready. But I promise, if you speak here, you'll be heard. Rachel's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. The silence was her only reply. Fragile, trembling, but real. The judge nodded slowly, respecting it. Then he closed the file once more and said quietly, We'll continue this tomorrow. As the gavel touched the wood, the sound was softer than usual, more of a punctuation than an end. And as the spectators filed out, a woman in the back whispered what everyone was thinking, but no one dared say aloud. That wasn't a speeding case. That was someone finding the courage to exist again. The courtroom was utterly still. You could hear the faint hum of the lights, the shifting of a single chair. Judge Caprio looked at Rachel over the rim of his glasses. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, but the words landed with weight. Ms. Rachel, he said, in my courtroom, truth doesn't hide behind dark glass. But I see now, you're not just wearing sunglasses. You're wearing shame that was never yours to carry. The silence that followed was like a held breath. Even the stenographer paused. Rachel's chin trembled, though she didn't move. Caprio waited, giving the moment space to breathe. Then he turned to the clerk. Bring in the officer who issued these tickets. A tall man in uniform stepped forward. His expression was professional, but his eyes flicked toward Rachel with something like regret. Caprio nodded to him. Officer, you wrote these citations, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Did you ever personally speak with Ms. Rachel? The officer hesitated. No, sir. But the car was seen multiple times parked near an address on Hillcrest Avenue, the residence of her ex-husband. On the surveillance footage, there's a woman driving. She looked similar to the defendant, but he trailed off. It wasn't her. Gasps rippled through the room. Rachel's hands gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles whitened. Caprio's gaze sharpened. You're certain? The officer nodded. Positive, Your Honor. Caprio leaned back in his chair. The room seemed to pulse with collective understanding. So, he said quietly, the violations were deliberate, not accidents. Someone wanted her name on those tickets. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came. Her shoulders began to shake. Not loud sobs, just silent tears tracing down her face. Caprio spoke again, voice low, resonant. You know why I ask people to look me in the eye, Ms. Rachel? Because the law isn't about paperwork. It's about the truth that lives inside people. She nodded weakly, her voice barely a whisper. He said no one would believe me. Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. I believe you, he said simply. But I need you to help me see everything. That was when the dam broke. Her words came haltingly at first, then faster, years of silence finding their way into sound. After the divorce, he wouldn't leave me alone, she said. He'd show up at my work, at my daughter's school. When I moved, he found us. He said he'd always know where I was because the car was still in my name. Every ticket was a reminder. His way of saying he still owned my life. The courtroom was frozen. Not even a cough. Just breathing, collective, uneasy. Caprio's jaw tightened, the only sign of anger he ever allowed himself in court. He used the law as a weapon, he said quietly. That ends today? He called for a brief recess, instructing his clerk to pull every record related to the citations and cross-reference them with the police database. His movements were measured, but the undercurrent in his tone was unmistakable, fury held in perfect control. Before leaving the bench, he looked back at Rachel. You did nothing wrong by surviving, he said. But now we're going to make sure surviving isn't the only thing you do. She nodded slowly, tears still glistening. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to, Caprio replied. The truth's already saying it for you. When he stood, the courtroom instinctively rose with him. There was no applause, no whispering, just reverent silence. Rachel remained seated, staring at the grain of the wooden table, her hands finally unclenched. For the first time in years, she looked less like a defendant and more like someone remembering what it felt like to be believed. Caprio paused before leaving, looking once more at the woman who had entered his courtroom hidden behind darkness. We'll resume tomorrow, he said softly. And when we do, we'll bring the rest of the light in. Then he turned, robe swaying, the echo of his steps fading into a silence thick enough to feel. It wasn't just a pause in proceedings. It was the sound of a world beginning to shift. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, townspeople filled the benches, and even a few officers stood along the sides. The air buzzed, not with noise, but with anticipation. Everyone knew something rare was about to happen. Judge Caprio entered quietly. He didn't strike the gavel or make a show of authority. He simply said, "Let's continue." Then the door opened again. A man in a tailored suit walked in, confident, composed, and radiating arrogance. Clayton, Rachel's ex-husband. His shoes clicked against the floor as if the sound itself was a statement. He smiled faintly at the crowd before taking his seat beside his attorney. Rachel sat just a few feet away, hands folded, eyes steady but tired. Caprio began, his tone neutral but firm. Mr. Clayton, you've been summoned in connection with the case of multiple traffic violations tied to a vehicle registered under your former spouse's name. Do you understand the reason you're here today? Clayton shrugged. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. We shared that car for years. Either one of us could have been driving. Even after the divorce? Caprio asked. Clayton gave a small, smug smile. We were still connected. You know how messy things can get. A few people in the audience murmured in disapproval. Caprio's expression didn't change. And you're saying you have no recollection of driving that vehicle during the times in question? Clayton's lawyer leaned forward. My client doesn't recall specific dates, Your Honor. These events occurred months ago. Caprio nodded slowly, then gestured to the clerk. Play the footage. The screens on either side of the courtroom flickered to life. The video showed a car rolling through a red light, the driver clearly visible. It paused, frame frozen on Clayton's face. The reaction was instant. A low rumble of voices swept through the room. Clayton's smirk faltered. Caprio's voice, quiet but unyielding. That is you, Mr. Clayton? Clayton stammered. I suppose it could be. The angle. Save it. Caprio cut in, his tone sharp for the first time. You were behind the wheel. The car was still registered to your ex-wife. Every fine, every citation, every letter went to her. You did that deliberately. Clayton leaned forward, defensive. I just wanted her to take responsibility. She never finishes anything. Someone had to teach her. The courtroom erupted, gasps, a few angry whispers. Caprio struck his gavel once, the sound like thunder. Silence returned. He turned toward Rachel. Ms. Rachel, remain seated, please. Then, to Clayton. You think humiliation is responsibility? That torment is justice? Clayton's jaw tightened. You don't know what she's like. Caprio's eyes narrowed. I know what you are like. A man who mistakes control for strength. Clayton opened his mouth, but the judge's hand went up. Enough. He turned to the clerk. Strike the violations from Ms. Rachel's record. All of them. Gasps again. Then, measured and deliberate, Caprio continued. Refer the documentation to the Providence Police Department for investigation under harassment statutes. And ensure this court provides Ms. Rachel access to the Women's Economic Renewal Program. Rachel looked up, startled. It's a community initiative, Caprio explained gently. For women rebuilding after loss or abuse. You qualify, MS. Rachel, not because of what you've suffered, but because of what you endured. The room fell completely silent again. Clayton tried to interrupt. This is ridiculous. Caprio's voice cut through like glass. Mr. Clayton, you may remain silent or face contempt. I strongly recommend the first option. For once, the man who'd always spoken too much said nothing. Rachel's shoulders trembled. Not from fear, but release. Caprio leaned forward, hands folded. His tone softened. You see, Mr. Clayton, real responsibility isn't punishing the weak. It's protecting them. You failed that test. He looked back to Rachel. And you, Ms. Rachel, you passed it the moment you walked in here. The crowd erupted in quiet applause, restrained but full of feeling. Caprio lifted his hand slightly, signaling calm. Don't applaud me, he said softly. Applaud her. She's the one who had the courage to stop running. Rachel turned toward the judge, eyes wet but steady. For the first time, she didn't look like a defendant or a victim. She looked free. As the gavel struck, the sound wasn't an end, it was a beginning. In that small courtroom, justice didn't just correct a record. It rewrote a life. Weeks later, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The familiar creak of wooden benches echoed softly as Judge Caprio entered, not for a case, but to deliver closing remarks to a group of volunteers. His tone was reflective, almost intimate. There are cases you close, he said, and there are stories that stay with you. Some verdicts echo long after the gavel falls. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Rachel stepped inside. No sunglasses, no trembling hands, just a calm, steady presence that drew every eye toward her. Caprio's face softened with surprise and something like pride. Ms. Rachel, he said, rising slightly. Back so soon. She smiled faintly. Not as a defendant this time, Your Honor. As a volunteer. The room stirred. She explained that she'd joined a new outreach program, one Caprio himself had helped create after her hearing. It offered support for women rebuilding their lives after abuse, a place where they could learn skills, manage finances, and, most importantly, be seen. Caprio gestured toward the empty front row. You've turned courage into purpose. That's rarer than justice itself. Rachel shook her head gently. No, Judge. You just gave me permission to stop hiding. He smiled. I only reminded you that the truth was already strong enough. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside, an elegant keychain shaped like a pair of tiny sunglasses. A reminder, she said quietly, that sometimes people wear darkness because they've forgotten what light feels like. Caprio looked down at the token, then back at her. And now, she said, I run a salon again. Small but mine. Every woman I hire has been through something like me. We fix hair, but mostly, we fix confidence. The judge chuckled softly. Then you're in the same business I am. The gallery smiled. Rachel hesitated, then added, when you told me the law wasn't about papers, but people, I didn't believe you. Now I do. He nodded slowly. The law is the frame. Justice is the picture inside it. They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound not by the rules of court, but by shared understanding. Then Caprio said, with that quiet grace that had made him beloved far beyond providence, sometimes justice doesn't arrive in black and white. It comes in color, the color of forgiveness, courage, and starting over. Rachel's eyes glistened. You helped me see that. He smiled again, setting the little sunglasses on his bench. No, Ms. Rachel. You did that yourself. The camera of life seemed to pull back, the light in the courtroom growing warmer, softer. As she turned to leave, Caprio's voice followed her. One more thing. She stopped at the door. You were never the one on trial, he said. You were just waiting for someone to remind you that you were innocent all along. Rachel's smile trembled, but it held. And when she stepped outside into the sun, she didn't reach for her glasses. For the first time in years, she didn't need them.